What happens when a woman discovers she's been sold to a millionaire, and he promises never to touch her? Grace Moretti accepted 12 months of fake marriage. Cold, temporary. Theodore Whitmore thought he could hire a wife without risking his heart. They were both wrong, because some promises are impossible to keep. This is their story. Let's begin. The morning sunlight pierced through the thin curtains of the Moretti family's modest dining room, illuminating dust particles that danced in the air like tiny witnesses to betrayal. Grace Moretti had just set down a cup of tea when she heard voices rising from her parents' bedroom. Voices that carried the weight of desperation and the sharp edge of negotiation. She pressed her ear against the door, her breath catching in her throat. "The debt collectors gave us 2 weeks," her father's voice cracked. "2 weeks, Maria. If we don't pay, we lose everything. The house, the bakery, your mother's medical bills." "Then we accept his offer," her mother responded, her voice steady in a way that sent chills down Grace's spine. "Mr. Whitmore said he needs a wife for appearance. 1 year. That's all. He'll pay everything off." Grace stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth. The world tilted on its axis. They were talking about her. They were selling her. 3 hours later, Grace sat across from him in a conference room that smelled of leather and old money. Theodore Whitmore didn't look like a man who bought people. He looked like a man who commanded boardrooms and crushed competitors before breakfast. Tall, with silver-touched dark hair and eyes the color of a winter storm, he radiated control from every perfectly tailored inch of his three-piece suit. He slid a document across the mahogany table. No wedding planners, no romantic music. Just cold, hard contract law. "The terms are simple, Miss Moretti." Theodore's voice was smooth, detached, professional. "We marry for precisely 12 months. You'll live in my estate, attend necessary social functions, and maintain the appearance of a devoted wife. In exchange, your family's debt, all $847,000, will be erased within 72 hours. Grace's fingers trembled as she touched the document's edge. "And what do you get?" "Credibility," he answered without hesitation. "My late father's will stipulates I must be married to assume full control of Whitmore Industries. The board doesn't care about love, they care about stability, tradition, appearances. So I'm convenient." "Precisely." He leaned forward, and for the first time she noticed the exhaustion hidden behind his commanding presence. "But understand this, Miss Moretti. This is a business arrangement, nothing more. I promise you 3 things: financial security for your family, respect for your personal space, and complete freedom when our year concludes." "No touch?" Grace whispered, the words catching in her throat. Theodore's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "No touch, no love, no complications, just the contract." She should have felt relieved. Instead, something twisted in her chest. A warning her heart gave before her mind could catch up. This man with his fortress of rules and his eyes that looked like they'd forgotten how to soften, he terrified her in ways that had nothing to do with fear. Grace lifted the gold pen he'd placed beside the contract. Her hand hovered over the signature line. "My grandmother is sick," she said quietly. "The cancer treatments. My parents used their retirement fund. They took loans from people who don't accept 'I'm sorry' as payment. I'm aware of your family's situation. Then you know I don't have a choice. Everyone has a choice, Miss Moretti." His eyes met hers, and for a split second, she saw something flicker behind the ice, something almost human. "I'm simply offering you the one that hurts least." The pen touched paper. Grace Moretti signed away 12 months of her life to a man who promised never to want her. She just wished her racing heart had received the same memo. That evening, Grace sat in her childhood bedroom, surrounded by boxes she was told to pack. Her younger sister, Lucia, perched on the edge of the bed, tears streaming down her face. "How can they do this to you?" Lucia sobbed. "How can Mama and Papa just give you away?" Grace pulled her sister close, breathing in the familiar scent of her strawberry shampoo. "They're not giving me away, Lou. They're drowning and I'm choosing to throw them a lifeline. But you're sacrificing everything. Your art degree, your dreams of opening a gallery, My dreams don't matter if Nonna dies because we can't afford her medicine, Grace interrupted gently. Besides, it's only a year. 12 months. I can survive anything for 12 months. Lucia pulled back, studying her sister's face with the brutal honesty only siblings possess. You're terrified of him, aren't you? Not because he's cruel, but because of something else. Grace's fingers found the delicate gold cross her mother had given her for confirmation. The only jewelry she owned that held real value, though not the monetary kind. I'm terrified, she admitted in a whisper, because when he looked at me today, for just 1 second, I forgot he was a stranger. I forgot this was business. And that, little sister, is the most dangerous thing that could possibly happen. The wedding was scheduled for Saturday, 4 days away. 4 days until Grace Moretti became Mrs. Theodore Whitmore. 4 days until she entered a marriage built on contracts and distance where love was explicitly forbidden and touch was against the rules. What Grace didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, was that Theodore Whitmore had built his empire on control. He controlled his emotions, his reactions, his desires, his entire existence with an iron will that had never once faltered. But some rules, no matter how carefully constructed, are made to be broken, and some promises, no matter how sincerely meant, are impossible to keep, especially when the heart decides it's tired of obeying. The dress hung in Grace's childhood closet like a ghost of someone else's dream. Ivory silk, simple lines, no train, no veil, nothing that screamed fairy tale. Her mother had insisted on at least buying something new, as if a store-bought dress could somehow legitimize what they were all pretending wasn't happening, as if white fabric could transform a transaction into something sacred. Grace stood before her bedroom mirror, the dress clinging to her frame in ways that felt both elegant and exposing. She'd pulled her dark hair into a low bun, letting a few rebellious curls frame her face. No makeup artist, no professional styling. Just her, a drugstore lipstick and the growing knot in her stomach. You look beautiful, mija, her father whispered from the doorway, his voice thick with guilt that no amount of gratitude could erase. Grace turned to face him. Roberto Moretti had aged 10 years in the past week. New lines creased his forehead and his shoulders sagged under the weight of what he'd agreed to. He held a small bouquet of daisies, her favorite flower, the only personal touch in this impersonal arrangement. Papa, Grace said softly, crossing to him. Don't. Don't what? Don't torture yourself. I made this choice. I gave you no choice, he corrected, his eyes glistening. What kind of father trades his daughter's happiness for? For Nonna's life? Grace interrupted gently. For Lucia's future? For the bakery that's been in our family for 3 generations? She took the daisies from his trembling hands. That kind of father. The kind who loves his family enough to accept help, even when it comes wrapped in complicated packages. Roberto pulled her into an embrace that felt like both a blessing and an apology. The venue was a private chapel on the Whitmore estate, a structure of stone and stained glass that had witnessed generations of family ceremonies. Grace had expected cold grandeur, but instead found unexpected intimacy. Soft piano music filled the space. White roses adorned every pew. Candles flickered like tiny prayers. Only immediate family attended. Theodore's requirement, not hers. The fewer witnesses to this manufactured marriage, the cleaner the eventual dissolution. Grace stood in the chapel's anteroom, her father beside her. As a coordinator she'd never met fussed with her dress and whispered instructions about timing and pacing. Remember, the woman said cheerfully, when you reach the altar, look at your groom. The photographer needs that moment of connection. Make it look natural. Natural. Grace almost laughed at the absurdity. The music shifted. Her cue. Ready, mija? Her father asked. Grace's fingers tightened around her bouquet. No, but let's go anyway. The chapel doors opened. Every head turned. But Grace saw only one person. Theodore Whitmore stood at the altar in a charcoal suit that made him look like he'd stepped out of an old Hollywood film. Classic, commanding, devastatingly composed. His hands were clasped in front of him, his posture military straight, his expression carefully neutral. "Don't look at him," Grace told herself as she began the slow walk down the aisle. "This is temporary. Business. A performance. Don't." He looked up. Their eyes met. And Grace forgot how to breathe. It wasn't that Theodore was handsome, though he was in that sharp-edged, dangerous way that made smart women reconsider their life choices. It was the intensity. The way his steel-gray eyes locked onto hers with a focus that made the rest of the chapel disappear. The way his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, as if he too was unprepared for whatever current suddenly crackled through the space between them. Grace's steps faltered. Her father's hand steadied her elbow. "Keep walking. Keep breathing. Don't let him see that he affects you." But as she drew closer, she noticed details that undid her careful composure. The slight tension in Theodore's shoulders beneath his perfect suit, the way his throat moved as he swallowed. The fact that his carefully neutral expression had cracked just enough to let something unnamed slip through. Something that looked almost like vulnerability. Impossible. Theodore Whitmore didn't do vulnerable. When Grace reached the altar, her father placed her hand in Theodore's with a whispered blessing. The touch sent electricity racing up her arm. Theodore's fingers were warm, strong, and trembling so slightly she almost thought she'd imagined it. Almost. The officiant began speaking, words about union and commitment that felt like beautiful lies in the context of their arrangement. Grace barely heard them. She was too focused on the man beside her, on the way he kept his eyes forward, on the muscle ticking in his jaw, on the fact that his thumb was making tiny, unconscious circles against her palm. Did he even realize he was doing it? "Theodore Whitmore," the officiant intoned, "do you take Grace Moretti to be your lawfully wedded wife?" A pause, longer than necessary. Theodore turned to face her fully. His eyes searched hers with an intensity that made her feel exposed, seen in ways that went far beyond the physical. When he spoke, his voice was low, steady, but carried an undercurrent of something raw. "I do." 2 words. They shouldn't have meant anything. They were part of the script, the performance, the elaborate charade. So why did they sound like a confession? "Grace Moretti," the officiant continued, "do you take Theodore Whitmore to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Grace's mouth went dry. This was it. The point of no return. Once she said those words, she would be bound to this man, legally, socially, contractually. For 12 months, her life would be his, even if her heart was supposed to remain her own. She looked at Theodore, really looked at him, past the expensive suit and the commanding presence, past the rules and the contracts. And for just a moment, she saw what he was trying so hard to hide. Loneliness. This man who had everything was utterly, profoundly alone. "I do," Grace whispered. The officiant smiled. "Then by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." Theodore went rigid. Grace's heart hammered against her ribs. The kiss. She'd known it was coming, had prepared herself for it, told herself it was just part of the show. A quick peck for the camera. Meaningless. Professional. Theodore leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. His hand came up to cup her face with surprising gentleness. His thumb brushed her cheekbone. "Forgive me," he murmured, so quietly only she could hear. "Just for the photograph." Then his lips met hers. The kiss was supposed to be brief, chaste, appropriate for a chapel full of family members and a photographer documenting their union. It started that way. Theodore's lips were soft against hers, his touch careful, controlled, a perfect performance of matrimonial affection. Grace could feel the restraint in every measured second, could sense how hard he was working to keep the kiss exactly what it needed to be, and nothing more. But then something shifted. Grace's hands, which had been hovering awkwardly at her sides, found their way to Theodore's chest. She could feel his heartbeat through the fabric, racing, thundering, as out of control as her own. Theodore's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly against her face. The kiss deepened by degrees. Not dramatically, not obviously enough for their small audience to notice, but enough that Grace felt it in every nerve ending. His other hand found the small of her back, pulling her closer by inches. The world narrowed to sensation. The warmth of his mouth, the woodsy scent of his cologne, the solid strength of his body against hers. The way he kissed her like he was trying to memorize the shape of her lips, like he was drowning, and she was air. Someone cleared their throat. Theodore pulled back abruptly, his eyes wide, his breathing uneven. For 3 full seconds, he stared at Grace with an expression that looked dangerously close to panic. Then the mask slammed back into place. "Congratulations," the officiant announced cheerfully, oblivious to the tension crackling between the newlyweds. Applause erupted. Grace's mother was crying. Lucia was taking photos with her phone. Theodore's business associate, the only person on his side of the chapel, nodded approvingly. But Grace couldn't hear any of it over the roaring in her ears. That kiss was supposed to be nothing. It was everything. And judging by the way Theodore wouldn't meet her eyes, by the way his hand trembled slightly as he signed the marriage certificate, by the way he put 3 feet of careful distance between them the moment protocol allowed, he knew it too. The reception was mercifully brief. Cake, champagne, polite conversation that felt surreal given what had just happened. Theodore played his part perfectly. The attentive groom, the gracious host, the man who'd just married for love rather than legal necessity. Only Grace saw the cracks. The way he gripped his champagne flute a little too tightly. The way his smile never quite reached his eyes. The way he managed to stand near her without ever actually touching her again. As the evening wound down, Theodore's driver appeared at his elbow. "The car is ready, sir. Your flight leaves in 90 minutes. Grace's head snapped up. "Flight?" Theodore finally looked at her directly. "We're expected in Napa Valley. I have a meeting there on Monday. The estate has prepared accommodations." He paused, something flickering across his face. "Separate bedrooms, of course, as agreed." "Of course," Grace echoed, the words tasting like ash. 30 minutes later, Grace found herself in the back of a luxury sedan, her simple dress replaced with comfortable travel clothes, her new husband beside her in perfect silence. The wedding was over. The performance was done. Now came the hard part, living with a man she was married to but forbidden to love, sharing space with someone she was supposed to keep at arm's length, surviving 12 months with the memory of that kiss burning between them like a secret neither dared acknowledge. Grace stared out the window at the passing lights, her fingers unconsciously touching her lips. Theodore stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched, his hands fisted in his lap. Neither spoke. But in the silence, a truth neither could admit hung heavy as gravity. Some promises are impossible to keep from the very first moment they're broken. And that kiss, that too long, too real, too dangerous kiss, had broken everything. The Napa Valley estate wasn't a hotel. It was a private residence that belonged to Theodore's business partner, a sprawling vineyard property with guest houses that rivaled 5-star resorts. Grace had expected separate rooms, separate buildings even, maximum distance to maintain their carefully constructed boundaries. Instead, the estate manager led them to a single suite. "Mr. Whitmore, your usual accommodations," the woman said brightly, opening double doors to reveal a space that was equal parts elegant and intimate. Exposed wooden beams crossed the ceiling. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked moonlit vineyards. And in the center of it all, impossible to ignore, stood one enormous bed. Grace's stomach dropped. "There's been a mistake," Theodore said immediately, his voice tight. "I requested—" "2 bedrooms, yes, sir," the manager interrupted apologetically. "Unfortunately, we're hosting a wedding party this weekend. Every guest house is at capacity. This was the only suite available." She gestured toward a plush sofa near the fireplace. "But the couch converts to a bed, and we've provided extra linens. Will that suffice?" Theodore's jaw worked. Grace could practically see him calculating alternatives, other hotels, other arrangements, any solution that didn't involve sharing intimate space with his brand new wife. "It's fine," Grace heard herself say. "We'll make it work." The manager smiled with relief, provided instructions about breakfast and amenities, and left them alone in the suite with their luggage and the elephant in the room that happened to be king-sized and covered in expensive linens. Theodore immediately crossed to the windows, putting maximum distance between himself and the bed. "You take the bedroom, I'll take the couch." "Theodore, you're 6'3". That couch will destroy your back. I've slept in worse places." "When? During your boarding school days?" Grace dropped her bag by the door, surprising herself with her boldness. "This is ridiculous. We're both adults. We can share a space for one night without..." "Without what?" Theodore turned to face her, and Grace was struck by the tension radiating from him. "Without acknowledging what happened at the chapel? Without admitting that kiss was..." He stopped abruptly, his hands curling into fists. "Was what?" Grace challenged quietly. Theodore's eyes met hers across the room. In the low lamplight, they looked almost black. "A mistake." The word landed like a slap. Grace told herself she shouldn't feel hurt. This was exactly what they'd agreed to, exactly what the contract stipulated. No complications, no feelings. Certainly no chemistry that made expensive wedding kisses last far longer than professional necessity required. "Right," she said, keeping her voice steady. "A mistake. Got it." She grabbed her overnight bag and headed for the bathroom, needing space, needing to breathe, needing to get away from Theodore and his rules and the way he looked at her like she was both irresistible and utterly forbidden. 20 minutes later, Grace emerged in cotton pajama pants and an oversized NYU shirt, her comfort clothes, the opposite of seductive. She'd scrubbed her face clean, pulled her hair into a messy bun, armored herself in casualness. Theodore had changed, too. Gone was the suit, replaced by dark lounge pants and a fitted t-shirt that did nothing to hide his athletic build. He'd attempted to make up the couch with the provided linens, but had clearly given up halfway through. He stood by the fireplace now, staring into flames he'd somehow coaxed to life, a glass of wine in his hand. "There's another glass on the counter," he said without turning around. "Cabernet from the estate. Supposedly excellent, though I'm not much of a wine enthusiast." Grace poured herself a glass, grateful for something to do with her hands. The wine was rich, complex, warmer than she'd expected. She moved to the opposite end of the fireplace, maintaining careful distance. Silence stretched between them, heavy, loaded, full of everything they weren't saying. "I'm sorry," Theodore finally spoke, his voice low. "About what I said. Calling the kiss a mistake was unkind, but accurate, but complicated." He took a long drink of wine. "This arrangement works only if we maintain boundaries, clear lines, no blurring." "Is that what we did?" Grace asked. "Blur lines?" Theodore's grip tightened on his glass. "Grace, I'm genuinely asking," she pressed, "because I need to understand the rules if I'm going to live by them for the next 12 months. Was the kiss too long, too real? Did I do something wrong?" "You did nothing wrong." Theodore finally looked at her, and Grace saw exhaustion in his eyes, the kind that came from fighting yourself rather than external battles. "The problem is that we..." He set down his glass with deliberate care, as if afraid he might shatter it. "Do you know why I needed this arrangement, why I couldn't simply marry someone appropriate?" Grace shook her head, sensing they were entering territory far more personal than contract terms. Theodore moved to the windows overlooking the dark vineyards. 5 years ago, I was engaged. Catherine. We'd known each other since childhood. Our families moved in the same circles, attended the same clubs, had the same expectations. His voice was flat, recounting facts rather than feelings. She was beautiful, accomplished, perfect on paper. Everyone agreed we were ideal together. Grace's chest tightened. What happened? I discovered she was having an affair with my business partner. Had been for months. Theodore's reflection in the window showed no emotion, but his shoulders were rigid. Not because she loved him, because she was bored, because I worked too much, felt too little, was too controlled. Her words, not mine. Theodore. I called off the engagement, he continued as if Grace hadn't spoken, dissolved the partnership, rebuilt the company from scratch. And I promised myself I would never again confuse business with emotion, contract with connection, necessity with anything else. Understanding crashed over Grace. That's why you needed this arrangement, not just for the inheritance, for protection. I don't believe in love, Grace. Theodore turned to face her, his expression carefully blank. I don't trust it. I don't want it. And I don't intend to pursue it. What I needed was exactly what you provided. A solution. Clean, temporary, transactional. So when we kissed, I broke my own rules. Theodore crossed the room toward her, stopping just close enough that Grace could see gold flecks in his gray eyes. For approximately 45 seconds, I forgot that you're an obligation, not a choice. That this is business, not romance. That in 12 months you'll walk out of my life as easily as you walked into it. Grace's breath caught. And that terrifies you. Yes. The admission seemed to cost him something. Because I can't afford to feel things, Grace. Feelings compromise judgment. They create vulnerabilities. They lead to mistakes that cost more than money. So I'm a potential mistake? No. Theodore's hand lifted, hovering near her face before he caught himself and dropped it. You're the certainty that I'm capable of making one. The wine glass trembled in Grace's hand. She set it down on the nearby mantel before she could drop it. What do you want me to do with that information? Help me keep the boundaries. Theodore's voice was almost pleading. Don't ask me questions that make me want to answer honestly. Don't look at me the way you're looking at me right now. Don't be what? Don't be easy to care about. The words hung between them like a confession and a warning tangled together. Grace knew she should step back, create distance, reinforce those boundaries he was so desperate to maintain. The smart move was to nod, agree, retreat to opposite corners of the suite and survive the night with their arrangement intact. Instead, she asked the question that had been burning in her chest since the chapel. What if I don't want to make it easy for you? Theodore went completely still. Grace, what if I think your rules are designed to keep you safe but lonely? She took a step closer, watching his eyes widen almost imperceptibly. What if I believe that the man who trembled when he kissed me, who holds doors open for elderly women, who paid off my family's debt without requiring humiliation or groveling, deserves more than a life of careful distance and emotional isolation? You don't know what you're saying. Don't I? Another step. They were inches apart now, close enough that Grace could see his pulse hammering in his throat. You hired me to play a role, Theodore, to be your wife in name only. But you never specified that I had to pretend not to see you, the real you underneath all that control. There's nothing underneath. But his voice cracked on the words. Liar. Grace reached up, her fingers hovering near his face the way his had hovered near hers. You're terrified right now, I can see it. Not of me. Of what I represent. The possibility that your carefully constructed walls might not be as impenetrable as you need them to be. Theodore caught her wrist. Not roughly, but firmly. His breathing was uneven. Grace, if you keep pushing, what, you'll fire me? We're legally married. What happens if you break the contract? That's not... He closed his eyes, struggling for composure. I'm trying to protect you. From what? From me. Theodore's eyes opened, and Grace saw raw honesty there. From the fact that I'm not a good man, Grace. I'm cold, I'm controlling, I'm... Human, Grace interrupted softly. You're human. Wounded, maybe. Wary, definitely. But not the monster you're trying to convince yourself you are. His grip on her wrist loosened but didn't release. His thumb found her pulse point. Whether consciously or unconsciously, Grace couldn't tell. They stood there in the firelight, close enough to kiss, far enough to maintain plausible deniability. "Tell me about the necklace," Theodore said suddenly, his eyes dropping to the delicate cross at her throat, the same one she'd worn at the wedding. "You touch it when you're nervous. You were touching it when you signed the contract." Grace's free hand moved automatically to the pendant. "My mother gave it to me at my confirmation. She said—" She paused, unsure why she was about to share something so personal with this man who claimed to want distance. She said faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about trusting that there's meaning in the questions. "Do you believe that?" "I don't know yet." Grace met his eyes. "But I think maybe I'm supposed to find out over the next 12 months. Theodore's expression shifted, some wall cracking, some defense lowering. "You should hate me. For what your parents did, for what I'm asking of you." "I should," Grace agreed. "But I don't. And that confuses me almost as much as it clearly terrifies you." Grace. Her name was a prayer and a plea. "I'm not asking you to love me," she said quietly. "I'm not asking you to break your rules or abandon your boundaries or risk your heart. I'm just asking you to stop treating me like I'm dangerous, simply because you felt something when we kissed." "You are dangerous," Theodore whispered. "You're the most dangerous person I've ever met." "Why?" "Because you make me want things I promised myself I'd never want again." The admission hung in the air between them. Theodore released her wrist abruptly, putting several steps of distance between them as if proximity itself was the threat. "We should sleep," he said, his voice rough. "Long day. Early meeting tomorrow." Grace knew dismissal when she heard it, but she also knew something had shifted in this room tonight. Some boundary had been tested, if not quite breached. Some truth had been spoken that couldn't be unspoken. "Theodore," she called as he moved toward the couch. He turned, guarded. "For what it's worth," Grace said, "I think Catherine was an idiot." A ghost of a smile flickered across Theodore's face. Brief, barely there, but genuine. "For what it's worth, I think you're too generous with your compassion. Maybe that's exactly what you need. Or exactly what will destroy us both." Grace climbed into the enormous bed alone, hyper-aware of Theodore's presence 15 feet away, separated by furniture and rules and fear. She could hear him shifting on the couch, trying to find comfort where none existed. "The bed is big enough for 2 adults to maintain respectful distance," she offered into the darkness. "Good night, Grace. I'm just saying, your back is going to hate you tomorrow." "My back will survive." "Stubborn man." A pause. Then, so quietly she almost missed it. "Stubborn woman." Grace smiled despite herself. She pulled the covers up, surrounded by expensive linens and the lingering scent of Theodore's cologne that somehow permeated the pillows. She didn't sleep for hours. Neither did he. She could tell by his breathing. Too controlled, too measured. The sound of someone forcing themselves to remain still when everything in them wanted to move. Around 3 in the morning, Grace heard him get up. Footsteps crossed to the windows. She opened her eyes just enough to see his silhouette against the moonlit vineyards, a solitary figure keeping watch over nothing and everything. He stood there for 20 minutes before returning to the couch. Grace finally fell asleep, wondering what Theodore was protecting them from, and whether protection was the same as preservation, or just a slower form of dying. 6 weeks later. Grace pressed her forehead against the cool marble of the bathroom counter, willing her stomach to settle. This was the 3rd morning in a row she'd woken feeling like she'd been poisoned. The 4th time this week she'd barely made it to the bathroom before losing whatever remained in her system. Food poisoning, she'd told herself initially. A stomach virus. Stress from navigating life as Theodore Whitmore's contractual wife while pretending the tension between them wasn't slowly driving her insane. But deep down, in that part of her brain that connected dots before conscious thought could intervene, Grace knew. She just wasn't ready to admit it yet. "Grace?" Theodore's voice came from the bedroom of their Connecticut estate, the primary residence they'd moved into after Napa. "The car leaves in 30 minutes, are you—" He stopped in the bathroom doorway. Grace could see his reflection in the mirror, Expensive suit, perfectly styled hair, concern breaking through his usual careful composure. "You're ill." It wasn't a question. "I'm fine." Grace straightened, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. "Just something I ate." "You said that yesterday." "Then I'm consistently making poor food choices." Theodore crossed his arms, his gray eyes studying her with the same intensity he brought to business negotiations. "You've barely eaten anything for 3 days. I've watched you push food around your plate at every meal. Monitoring my eating habits now? That wasn't in the contract." The joke fell flat. Theodore moved into the bathroom, closing the distance between them with purposeful strides. He pressed the back of his hand to her forehead, checking for fever. A gesture so unexpectedly gentle that Grace forgot to breathe. "No temperature," he murmured. "But you're pale. And you've been exhausted. Yesterday you fell asleep during the gallery opening. It was boring. It was your favorite artist. You were excited for weeks." His hand dropped from her forehead but didn't retreat far. "Grace, if something's wrong—" "Nothing's wrong," she interrupted, stepping back, needing space. "I'm just adjusting. New house, new life, new everything. It's a lot." Theodore's expression suggested he didn't believe her, but he nodded slowly. "Cancel the morning appointments. Rest. I'll have the housekeeper bring you." "I don't need a babysitter." Grace's voice came out sharper than intended. "I need you to stop hovering and let me handle my own body." Something flickered across Theodore's face. Hurt, maybe, or frustration. But he smoothed it away with practiced ease. "Of course. Forgive me for overstepping." He left without another word, and Grace heard herself in that tone, defensive, cruel, using distance as a weapon the same way he did. They'd gotten good at that over the past 6 weeks, dancing around each other in their shared spaces, maintaining polite conversations that never went deeper than surface observations, pretending that night in Napa hadn't happened, pretending they hadn't spent 2 more nights in that suite, pretending Theodore hadn't eventually abandoned the couch on the 3rd night, claiming his back couldn't take it, climbing into the opposite side of the massive bed with careful distance between them, pretending Grace hadn't woken on the 4th morning to find that distance erased, Theodore's arm draped over her waist, his face buried in her hair, both of them tangled together like they'd been doing it for years instead of hours, pretending they'd both acted shocked when their eyes opened, pretending the way Theodore had pulled her closer instead of away had been sleepy confusion, pretending the kiss that followed had been anything other than inevitable, pretending they hadn't broken every single rule they'd set. Grace stared at her reflection in the mirror, pale, exhausted, terrified. She couldn't pretend anymore. The drugstore was 3 blocks from the estate. Grace walked rather than calling the driver, needing the anonymity, needing to feel like a regular person buying regular things instead of Theodore Whitmore's contracted wife, purchasing evidence of how thoroughly their arrangement had fallen apart. She stood in the family planning aisle for 10 minutes, staring at boxes of pregnancy tests like they were written in a foreign language. A teenager with purple hair gave her a knowing look. An elderly woman patted her shoulder encouragingly. Grace grabbed 3 different brands and practically ran to the register. Back at the estate, she locked herself in the guest bathroom, not the master suite she technically shared with Theodore, but a smaller, more private space where no one would interrupt. She read the instructions 4 times before her shaking hands could manage to follow them. 3 minutes. The boxes all said 3 minutes. Grace sat on the closed toilet lid and counted seconds, her cross pendant clutched in her fist. "Please," she prayed, though she couldn't quite articulate what she was asking for. "Please let this be. Let this be." What? A mistake? The truth? A disaster? A blessing? The timer on her phone buzzed. Grace looked at the first test. 2 lines. Her hand shook harder as she checked the second, a plus sign. The third showed pregnant in tiny digital letters, as if the universe needed to spell it out explicitly. Grace set all 3 tests on the counter in a neat row, staring at them like they might change if she looked hard enough. Pregnant. She was pregnant with Theodore Whitmore's child, the man who'd married her to avoid emotional entanglement, who'd promised 12 months and then freedom, who'd built walls around his heart so high that Grace had spent 6 weeks trying to find a way over, around or through them. The man who'd touched her like she was precious on that 4th night in Napa, who'd whispered her name like a prayer, who'd looked at her afterward with such raw vulnerability that Grace had wanted to promise him things far beyond their contract's scope. The man who'd retreated behind his walls the next morning, apologizing for his lapse in judgment, suggesting they return to the original terms, treating her with polite distance that hurt more than anger would have. A sob caught in Grace's throat. She pressed her fist against her mouth, trying to contain the sound, but it escaped anyway. Ugly, raw, terrified. What was she supposed to do now? Grace didn't tell him immediately. She couldn't. She needed time to think, to plan, to figure out how to tell a man who'd hired her for temporary convenience that she was carrying permanent consequences. She made it through dinner, barely touching her food again, which earned another concerned look from Theodore that she deflected with practiced ease. She made it through the evening news, curled in her favorite chair, while Theodore reviewed contracts across the room. She made it through good night and separate retreats to separate spaces, maintaining the fiction that they were roommates rather than something infinitely more complicated. She did not make it through the night. Around 2 in the morning, Grace found herself in Theodore's study, staring at the contract they'd both signed. She'd retrieved it from his filing cabinet, a violation of privacy she couldn't bring herself to care about in the moment. She needed to see the words, needed to remember what she'd agreed to. The marriage will last exactly 12 months from the date of the ceremony. She read aloud to the empty room. Either party may terminate early only under circumstances of extreme breach. Upon completion, both parties will file for amicable divorce and resume separate lives. No mention of pregnancy. No clause for children. No provision for what happened when biology decided to rewrite the rules. Grace, she spun. Theodore stood in the doorway in lounge pants and nothing else, his hair disheveled, his eyes alert despite the hour. He looked at the contract in her hands, then at her face, and something in his expression shuddered. Having second thoughts? His voice was carefully neutral. If you want out of the arrangement early, we can discuss. I'm pregnant. The words escaped before Grace could stop them. Before she could plan her approach, soften the blow, prepare him for the news. They just fell into the space between them like bombs, like truth, like the end of everything they'd pretended they could control. Theodore went absolutely still, not frozen, still, like someone had hit pause on his entire existence. What? His voice was barely above a whisper. Grace set down the contract with trembling hands. I'm pregnant. About 6 weeks, I think. From Napa. That's not... Theodore's hand came up, rubbing his face like he was trying to wake from a nightmare. We were careful. We used... Nothing is 100%. Grace forced herself to meet his eyes. Apparently, we're in the small percentage of failures. Theodore crossed to his desk, gripping the edge like it was the only solid thing in a tilting world. You're certain? 3 tests, all positive. And you're keeping it? The question was barely audible. Grace's hand moved automatically to her still flat stomach. Protective, defensive. Yes? I wasn't suggesting, Theodore looked up sharply. I would never ask you to. I just meant, have you decided what you want to do? How you want to handle this? I don't know. Grace's voice cracked. I don't know anything except that I'm terrified and I'm sorry and I know this isn't what you signed up for. Grace, you paid for 12 months of pretend marriage, not a lifetime connection to someone you barely know. The words tumbled out faster now, panic overriding control. You can sue me for breach of contract or whatever, I don't care. My family will lose the money, lose the house, lose everything. But at least you'll be free from this disaster I've created. Grace, stop. Theodore moved around the desk, closing the distance between them. Stop. Breathe. I can't breathe. I can't think. I can't. She was crying now, ugly sobs that shook her entire frame. You were supposed to be safe. This was supposed to be simple. I was supposed to survive 12 months and go home and never have to see the way you're looking at me right now. How am I looking at you? Like I'm a problem you need to solve. That's not. Theodore reached for her, then stopped himself, his hands hovering awkwardly. May I touch you, please? The please broke something in Grace. She nodded, and Theodore pulled her against his chest, solid, warm, steady. One arm wrapped around her back, the other cradled her head, and for the first time since she'd seen those positive tests, Grace let herself fall apart. Theodore held her through it. Didn't try to shush her or fix her or make promises he couldn't keep. Just held her while she soaked his bare chest with tears and terror, and all the emotions she'd been trying so hard to contain. When the storm finally passed, Grace pulled back slightly, wiping her face with the back of her hand. Sorry. I got you're all. I don't care about my chest. Theodore's voice was rough. His hands moved to cup her face, tilting it up so she had to meet his eyes. Grace, listen to me. You are not a problem. This is not a disaster, and I am not looking at you like you're something I need to solve. Then how are you looking at me? Theodore's thumb brushed away a remaining tear. Like I'm terrified too. Grace's breath caught. You are? I'm absolutely terrified. A ghost of a smile flickered across his face. I don't know how to be a father. I don't know how to be a husband. A real one, not the contractual version. I don't know how to navigate this situation without hurting you or failing you or... He stopped, his jaw working. But I know one thing with absolute certainty. What? I'm not letting you go through this alone. Theodore, you don't have to. I know I don't have to. His eyes searched hers with an intensity that made Grace's knees weak. But that night in Napa, when I broke my own rules, when I let myself touch you the way I'd been wanting to since the moment you signed that contract, I knew I was playing with fire. I knew there would be consequences. And I did it anyway. Why? Theodore's expression shifted, some wall crumbling, some truth finally allowed to surface. Because for the first time in 5 years, I wanted something more than safety. I wanted you. And I'm done pretending otherwise. Grace's heart hammered against her ribs. What are you saying? I'm saying that contract on my desk means nothing anymore. Theodore's hands slid from her face to her shoulders, then down to find her hands, threading their fingers together. I'm saying that 12 months was always a lie I told myself to make this feel manageable. I'm saying that somewhere between the chapel and this moment, I stopped hiring you and started falling for you. You don't believe in love, Grace whispered, repeating his words from Napa. I didn't. Theodore pulled her hands up, pressing kisses to her knuckles. But then you walked into my life with your ridiculous compassion and your stubborn questions and your way of seeing past every defense I'd built. You made me believe in things I thought I'd outgrown. Hope, connection, the possibility that maybe, just maybe, I deserved more than lonely safety. Theodore, I love you, Grace. The words were rough, unpracticed, but absolutely sincere. I'm terrified of it, I'm terrible at showing it, and I will almost certainly mess this up more times than I get it right. But I love you, and I love this child we created. And if you'll let me, I want to spend the rest of my life proving that this was never temporary for me. Grace stared at him, at this man who'd promised her distance and was offering her everything instead. You're sure? Because once you say these things, you can't take them back. Once we cross this line... We crossed that line in Napa, Theodore interrupted. We crossed it the moment I kissed you at the altar and forgot it was supposed to be for show. We crossed it every time I watched you sleep and felt grateful you were in my house, in my life, in my... He stopped, pressing their joined hands against his chest, against his racing heart. We crossed it long before biology caught up with emotion. I love you too, Grace admitted, the words feeling like confession and freedom tangled together. I've been trying not to, trying to protect myself, trying to honor the contract, trying to survive 12 months without my heart getting involved. But it was involved from the beginning. I think maybe I started loving you the moment you asked permission before kissing me at the altar. Theodore's smile was real this time, full, genuine, transforming his entire face. We're terrible at following rules. The worst. Our child is going to be chaos. Absolutely. Theodore pulled her close again, this time without hesitation, without fear. His lips found hers in a kiss that tasted like tears and relief and promises that went far beyond contracts. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Theodore rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me again," he whispered. "For real this time. Not for inheritance or appearances or obligation. Marry me because you want to, because you love me, because you believe we can build something beautiful out of this mess we've created." Grace laughed through fresh tears. "We're already married." "Legally, yes. But that ceremony was a performance. I want to stand before everyone who matters and promise to love you, honor you, choose you every single day for the rest of our lives. I want our child to know their parents chose each other, not circumstance. Whenever you want." Theodore's hands found her still flat stomach, his touch reverent. "Before the baby comes, after. 10 years from now, I don't care about timing. I just need you to know that this time it's real." Grace covered his hands with hers. "It was always real, Theodore. We just needed time to admit it." They stood there in his study as dawn broke outside the windows, two people who'd signed a contract for convenience and ended up writing a love story instead. The pregnancy that should have been a disaster became the catalyst that finally broke through Theodore's last defenses. The temporary arrangement that should have expired in 6 more months became the foundation of something permanent, and the marriage that started with a promise of no touch, no love became the only promise that mattered. To touch, to love, to choose each other despite the fear, despite the rules, despite everything they'd thought they knew about protecting their hearts. Some mistakes, Grace thought as Theodore kissed her again, aren't mistakes at all. They're just the universe's way of giving you what you needed all along. 4 months later, Grace stood in front of the full-length mirror in the master bedroom, her hands resting on the pronounced curve of her belly. At 22 weeks, pregnancy had transformed her body in ways that still surprised her. The roundness where there'd been angles, the fullness where there'd been delicacy, the constant movement of a child who seemed determined to make their presence known at all hours. "Are you sure about this?" Theodore asked from the doorway, his reflection appearing behind hers in the mirror. He'd already dressed for the occasion. Dark suit, burgundy tie, that expression he got when he was trying to hide how nervous he felt. "About which part?" Grace turned to face him. "The vow renewal? Meeting with my family? Telling everyone the baby wasn't planned?" "All of it." Theodore crossed to her, his hands finding their familiar place on her waist. Over the past 4 months, touch had become their native language. Casual, constant, necessary. "We could postpone. Wait until after the baby comes. Your father's still processing everything and I don't want to pressure." "Theodore." Grace pressed her finger to his lips. "My father has had 4 months to process. If he's not ready now, another 6 months won't help." She softened her tone. "Besides, this matters. Not the ceremony itself, but what it represents. Choosing each other intentionally, publicly, honestly." Theodore captured her hand, kissing her palm. "You're braver than I am." "I'm terrified," Grace admitted. "Papa barely speaks to me. Mama cries every time she sees me. Lucia is the only one who's been supportive, and even she thinks we're rushing into making this real. We've been married for 7 months. A marriage that started as a transaction." Grace moved to the dresser, picking up the simple silver band Theodore had given her 2 months ago, a replacement for the expensive diamond she'd worn for show. This ring was smaller, more personal, engraved with coordinates, the latitude and longitude of the Napa vineyard where everything had changed. People don't forget that easily. "Do you care what people think?" Grace met his eyes in the mirror. "I care what my family thinks. They gave me up once to save themselves. I need them to understand that I chose to stay." The vow renewal was set for noon at a small chapel near the Moretti family bakery. Grace's choice, wanting something that felt like home rather than the cold grandeur of the Whitmore estate. Only immediate family had been invited. No photographer this time, no performance, just truth. Grace had chosen a simple cream dress that accommodated her growing belly, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. She carried wildflowers instead of formal arrangements, Daisies and baby's breath, simple and honest. Theodore waited at the altar, and this time when Grace walked down the aisle, her father conspicuously absent, her mother walking beside her instead, his expression held none of the careful neutrality from their first ceremony. His eyes shone with emotion he no longer tried to hide. When Grace reached him, Theodore took both her hands, his grip almost too tight. "You came," he whispered. "Did you think I wouldn't? I thought—" He glanced at the half-empty pews. "I thought you might realize you deserve better than a man who started this as a business arrangement." "I deserve exactly the man standing in front of me," Grace said firmly. "The one who brings me ginger tea at 3 in the morning when morning sickness hits. The one who reads parenting books when he thinks I'm sleeping. The one who cried when we found out we're having a daughter." Theodore's throat worked. "We should start before I lose my composure entirely." The officiant, the same one from their first ceremony, who'd been shocked but delighted to be asked back, smiled warmly. "We gather today not to create a marriage but to celebrate the transformation of one. Theodore and Grace, you've already spoken vows of obligation. Today you'll speak vows of devotion." Theodore went first, his prepared notes forgotten as he looked at Grace. "7 months ago, I hired you to solve a problem," he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the small chapel. "I told myself I needed a wife in name only, someone who'd play a role and disappear on schedule. I told myself I was too damaged for real connection, too controlled for messy emotions, too broken to risk my heart again." He paused, his thumb rubbing circles on her hand. "You destroyed every single one of those lies." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "You saw past my defenses when I was determined to keep them intact," Theodore continued. "You asked questions I didn't want to answer and refused to accept distance as intimacy. You made me laugh when I'd forgotten how. You made me feel when I'd convinced myself feeling was weakness." His voice roughened. "And you loved me before I deserved it, before I earned it, before I was brave enough to admit I needed it." He reached up, cupping her face with one hand. "Grace Whitmore, I vow to choose you every single day for the rest of my life. Not because a contract requires it, but because my heart demands it. I vow to be worthy of the gift you've given me, your trust, your love, your future. I vow to be the father our daughter deserves and the husband you never expected but somehow got stuck with anyway." A small smile broke through. "And I vow to never again pretend that loving you is anything other than the greatest privilege of my existence." Grace couldn't stop the tears now. She squeezed Theodore's hands, grounding herself. "Your turn," he whispered, "though anything you say will be anticlimactic after that." Grace laughed wetly. "No pressure." She took a breath, finding her words. "Theodore, when I signed that contract I was drowning," she said quietly. "My family was falling apart, my grandmother was dying, and I felt helpless to save any of it. You offered me a lifeline and I grabbed it without thinking about the cost. To my dreams, my freedom, my heart." She looked down at their joined hands. "I thought the price would be spending 12 months pretending to love someone I'd never actually know." She met his eyes. "But you refused to be a stranger. You saw me, really saw me, when I was trying so hard to be invisible. You treated my family's debt like an investment rather than charity. You held me when I cried and gave me space when I needed it and somehow knew exactly when to push and when to retreat." Her voice strengthened. "You made me believe that I wasn't something to be bought or sold, but someone to be cherished." Grace's hand moved to her belly, their daughter doing somersaults beneath her palm. "I vow to love you not despite how we started, but because of it," she said. "Because you took something transactional and made it transcendent. Because you broke your own rules to hold me. Because you're teaching me that love isn't about having all the answers. It's about asking the right questions together." She smiled through tears. "And I vow to remind you every single day that you're not broken, you're not too controlled, and you're definitely not too damaged. You're just Theodore, complicated, careful, capable of extraordinary tenderness, and that's exactly who I choose." Theodore pulled her close, their foreheads touching, both crying now without shame. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the officiant said, his own voice thick with emotion. Again. But this time, the way it was always meant to be. Theodore kissed Grace like he was sealing a promise, deep, genuine, unhurried. When they finally broke apart, applause erupted from their small audience. Except for one person. Roberto Moretti sat in the back pew, his face buried in his hands, his shoulders shaking. Grace's joy fractured. Theodore squeezed her hand. "Go," he murmured. "I'll wait." Grace found her father outside the chapel, leaning against the brick wall, staring at nothing. She'd prepared speeches for this moment, practiced what she'd say to bridge the gap that had grown between them. But seeing him like this, devastated, aged, broken, all her careful words evaporated. "Papa," she said simply. Roberto looked up, and Grace saw the same eyes that had comforted her through childhood nightmares, had taught her to ride a bike, had walked her down the aisle 7 months ago with guilt weighing down every step. "I sold you," he said hoarsely. "I sold my daughter to a stranger for money, and you're in there renewing vows to him like it's a fairy tale." "It is a fairy tale," Grace said quietly. "Just not the kind that starts with once upon a time, and the kind that starts with people making impossible choices and somehow finding grace in the consequences. Don't make excuses for what I did. I'm not." Grace moved closer. "What you did hurt me, Papa. It terrified me. Walking into that conference room to meet Theodore, knowing you'd negotiated my future without asking me, that's something I'll carry forever." Roberto flinched. "But here's what you didn't know," Grace continued. "Theodore wasn't buying a possession. He was offering a solution. He saw a family drowning and threw us a rope, yes, but he also saw me, Grace, not just Moretti's daughter, and he treated me like I had value beyond the contract. He paid for you. He paid our debts," Grace corrected. "There's a difference. And in the process, he gave me something you couldn't. Choice. Real choice. To stay or leave. To love or walk away. To build something genuine out of something broken." Roberto's face crumpled. "How can you forgive me?" "Because you're my father." Grace took his hands, rough from years of bakery work, trembling now with emotion. "Because you made an impossible choice in an impossible situation. Because I understand that sometimes love looks like sacrifice, even when that sacrifice feels wrong. I don't deserve your forgiveness." "Probably not." Grace smiled sadly. "But I'm giving it anyway. That's how grace works, Papa. It's undeserved, unearned, freely given. I learned that from the man you sold me to." Roberto pulled her into a fierce embrace, and Grace felt him shaking. With sobs or relief or the release of 4 months of carried guilt, she couldn't tell. Maybe all three. "I'm so sorry, mija," he whispered into her hair. "I'm so sorry." "I know, Papa. I know." They stood there for a long moment, father and daughter, healing what had been broken. When they finally pulled apart, Roberto wiped his eyes roughly. "He really loves you? This isn't still some arrangement?" "He really loves me," Grace confirmed. "And I really love him. The arrangement just gave us permission to find each other." "And the baby?" Grace's hand moved protectively to her belly. "Was a surprise for both of us. But a wanted one. A chosen one." Roberto's expression softened, his hand joining hers on the curve where his granddaughter grew. "A girl?" "A girl." Grace grinned. "Who already has her father wrapped around her tiny, not-yet-born finger. What will you name her?" Grace hesitated. This was something she and Theodore had discussed carefully, knowing the weight names carried. "We're thinking Faith, if that's okay with you." Roberto's eyes filled with fresh tears. "After your grandmother? After everything?" Grace touched her cross necklace. "After the faith it took to walk into the unknown. After the faith that brought us through it. After the faith that something beautiful could grow from something so complicated." Roberto nodded slowly. Then, with visible effort, he straightened his shoulders. "I should meet my son-in-law properly. Apologize for avoiding him for 4 months. Thank him for..." He trailed off. For loving your daughter when she needed it most? Grace supplied gently. For being a better man than I was. You're both good men who made hard choices, Grace said. That's enough. Inside the chapel, Theodore stood talking quietly with Grace's mother and sister, looking simultaneously relieved the ceremony was over and terrified of what came next. When he saw Grace return with her father, his entire body tensed. Roberto approached slowly. Theodore straightened, his businessman persona clicking into place. A defense mechanism Grace recognized immediately. Mr. Moretti, Theodore said formally, extending his hand. Thank you for coming. Roberto looked at the offered hand, then pushed it aside and pulled Theodore into an embrace that clearly shocked him. Grace watched her husband freeze, arms hovering awkwardly, before carefully returning the hug. I owe you an apology, Roberto said, pulling back but keeping his hands on Theodore's shoulders. And my gratitude, and probably a dozen other things I don't have words for. You owe me nothing, Theodore replied stiffly. She's everything. Caring for her isn't a burden, but it started as business. It started as business, Theodore agreed. It became love approximately 3 hours after I met her, though I was too stubborn to admit it for months. Roberto studied him with the assessing eye of a father. You'll be good to her, to my granddaughter. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of them, Theodore said quietly. Though I suspect I'll always fall short. Good. Roberto clapped his shoulder. The moment you think you're worthy is the moment you stop trying. Stay humble, stay grateful, and for God's sake, listen when she talks. Even when you think you know better. Especially then. Theodore agreed, his eyes finding Grace's across the room, warming with affection. Maria Moretti appeared with cake, homemade from the bakery, the kind Grace had grown up with. Lucia had champagne for those who could drink, and sparkling cider for Grace. They gathered around a small table in the chapel's hall, this makeshift family who'd started in debt and obligation, and somehow found their way to something resembling belonging. To Grace and Theodore, Lucia announced, raising her glass, may your second beginning be even better than your complicated first one. To second chances, Maria added softly. To choosing love, Roberto said, his voice steadier now, even when it chooses us first. Theodore looked at Grace, his hand finding hers beneath the table, their wedding bands catching the afternoon light. To forever, he said simply. The real kind, not the contractual one. Grace squeezed his hand. To forever. Later that evening, back at the estate, Grace stood in the nursery they'd been slowly putting together. Soft yellow walls, white furniture, a rocking chair by the window where she could already imagine late-night feedings and whispered lullabies. Theodore found her there, wrapping his arms around her from behind, his hand settling on her belly where their daughter was doing what felt like acrobatics. She's active tonight, he murmured against Grace's hair. She knows something important happened today. Grace leaned back against his chest. We made it official, made it real. It was always real, Theodore said. From the moment you walked into that conference room looking terrified and defiant at the same time. From the moment you signed that contract with your hand shaking but your signature steady. From the moment you refused to make this easy for me by being forgettable. Grace turned in his arms. Do you ever regret it? How we started? Theodore considered the question seriously, the way he considered everything important. I regret that you felt you had no choice. I regret that circumstances forced your hand. I regret every moment you spent afraid of me or worried I'd hold the contract over you. He cupped her face. But I don't regret meeting you. I don't regret that 7 months ago I was arrogant enough to think I could hire someone to play a role in my life without that person changing everything about it. We destroyed your 12-month plan spectacularly. You destroyed my 12-month plan the moment you asked me why I looked so lonely, Theodore corrected. Everything after that was just delayed acknowledgement. Grace smiled, remembering that conversation in Napa, how it had cracked something open in both of them. What do you think she'll be like, Faith? Stubborn like her mother, Theodore said immediately. Compassionate like her mother. Brave like her mother. Essentially, you duplicated with minor genetic contributions from me. She'll have your eyes, Grace predicted, and your need to control everything, which will drive us both insane. She'll have your heart, Theodore countered, which means I'll be outnumbered and outmaneuvered on a daily basis. Poor Theodore, two women who see right through you. My greatest weakness and greatest strength. He kissed her forehead. I wouldn't want it any other way. They stood there in the almost finished nursery, surrounded by the physical evidence of a future they'd never planned, but now couldn't imagine living without. The crib waiting for an infant who'd been conceived in rule-breaking. The changing table stocked with supplies bought by a man who'd sworn off emotional attachment. The bookshelf already filling with stories about love and magic and happily ever afters. Theodore? Grace said quietly. Thank you. He pulled back to look at her. For what? For being bad at following your own rules, Grace said. For breaking promises you never should have made. For loving me even when it complicated everything. For making me believe that sometimes the best things in life are the ones we never see coming. Theodore's expression softened with the vulnerability he'd learned to show her. Grace Moretti Whitmore, loving you has never been complicated. Living without you would be impossible. Everything else is just details. He kissed her then. Slow, sweet, full of promises that had nothing to do with contracts and everything to do with choice. Outside the nursery window, the sun set over the estate grounds. In the hallway, house staff moved quietly about their evening routines. In the master bedroom, the contract that had started everything sat in Theodore's desk drawer, signed and binding and completely irrelevant. Because some marriages begin with "I do" and end with divorce papers. Others begin with transactions and end with transformation. And a rare few begin with everything wrong and end with everything right. Not because circumstances were kind, but because two people decided that love was worth the risk of breaking every rule they'd carefully constructed to protect themselves from exactly this. Grace and Theodore's marriage was that rare few. Started in debt, sealed in obligation, consummated in rule-breaking, and ultimately, finally, beautifully, chosen in love. 3 months later, the contractions started at 2 a.m. Grace woke to a tightening sensation across her belly, not painful yet, just insistent, like her body was sending out a preliminary alert. She lay still for a moment, one hand on her stomach, timing the feeling, waiting to see if it would happen again. Beside her, Theodore slept deeply, one arm draped protectively across her waist, even in unconsciousness. Over the past 10 months, he'd become a light sleeper, attuned to every shift in her breathing, every restless movement. But tonight, exhaustion had finally claimed him after 3 consecutive days of board meetings. The second contraction came 12 minutes later. Grace carefully extracted herself from Theodore's embrace and padded to the bathroom. False labor, probably. Her due date wasn't for another week, and first babies notoriously came late. She'd read enough books, attended enough classes to know not to panic at the first sign. The third contraction hit while she was washing her hands. This one had teeth. Grace gripped the sink, breathing through it the way they'd practiced. When it passed, she looked at herself in the mirror, hair tangled from sleep, wearing one of Theodore's old college shirts, belly enormous and tight, and underneath the physical discomfort, a thrill of terrified excitement. This was happening. Their daughter was coming. "Theodore," she called, keeping her voice steady. "I need you." He was awake instantly, sitting up in bed, eyes alert despite the hour. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong." Grace walked back to the bedroom, timing her steps between potential contractions. "But I think Faith decided she's done waiting." Theodore went absolutely white. "You're in labor?" "Early stages, yes." "How early? Should I call the doctor? Get the car? Get your bag? Should we—" He was already pulling on clothes, his movements jerky with barely contained panic. Grace caught his hands, pulling him to a stop. "Theodore, breathe." "I am breathing." "You're hyperventilating." She guided his hand to her belly. "Feel her?" "She's fine. I'm fine. We have time." "How much time?" Hours probably. First labors are notoriously long. Another contraction rolled through, stronger this time. Grace's grip tightened on Theodore's hand, her breathing shifting to the rhythmic pattern they'd practiced. Theodore watched with wide eyes, looking more terrified than she'd ever seen him, including the day she'd told him about the pregnancy. When it passed, Grace smiled weakly. Okay, maybe not as much time as I thought. You should call Dr. Patterson. Theodore was already reaching for his phone with shaking hands. By 5 in the morning, they were at the hospital. Grace's contractions had progressed to 5 minutes apart, consistent, intense, unmistakable. Dr. Patterson had examined her and declared she was 4 centimeters dilated with several hours still to go. Several hours of this. Grace leaned against the hospital bed, swaying through another contraction while Theodore rubbed her lower back with steady pressure. The only thing that seemed to help. When it passed, she collapsed against him, sweating and exhausted and still not even halfway through. I can't do this, she whispered. Yes, you can, Theodore said firmly, his panic from earlier replaced with steady determination. You're the strongest person I know. I'm not strong, I'm scared. Being scared doesn't mean you're not strong. He pressed a kiss to her damp forehead. It means you're human, and you're doing this beautifully. I'm sweating and swearing, that's not beautiful. To me it is. Theodore's voice roughened. Watching you bring our daughter into the world, Grace, it's the most beautiful thing I've ever witnessed. Another contraction hit before Grace could respond. She groaned through it, her fingers digging into Theodore's arms hard enough to leave marks. He didn't flinch, just held her steady, breathing with her, anchoring her through the pain. Doing great, Dr. Patterson said from her monitoring station. Baby's heartbeat is perfect. You're progressing well. Grace wanted to say something sarcastic about progressing well, feeling like being torn apart from the inside, but another contraction stole her words. At 8 in the morning, Grace's family arrived. Maria brought homemade cookies that Grace couldn't imagine eating but appreciated nonetheless. Roberto paced the waiting room with the nervous energy of every father-to-be. Lucia set up camp with her phone, ready to document the first photos of her niece. Theodore emerged from the delivery room long enough to update them, still in early labor, everything progressing normally. Yes, he was holding up fine, though that was clearly a lie based on his haunted expression. How is she really? Roberto asked quietly. Strong, Theodore said. Terrified. In pain. Incredible. He rubbed his face. I feel completely useless. I can't fix this. Can't make it easier. Can't. You can be there, Roberto interrupted. That's not useless. That's everything. Theodore nodded, but Maria caught his arm before he could return to the room. She needs you steady, Maria said gently. Not panicked. Whatever fear you're feeling, you leave it out here with us. In there, you're her rock. Understand? Theodore's throat worked. I'm terrified something will go wrong. Welcome to parenthood, Roberto said with grim humor. That feeling never goes away. You just learn to function despite it. And if I can't? Then you fake it, Maria said simply. For her. For your daughter. You fake strength until it becomes real. Theodore took a shaky breath, squared his shoulders, and walked back through the door with renewed purpose. By noon, Grace was 7 centimeters dilated and losing her grip on composure. The contractions came in waves that left no time to recover between them. The breathing techniques that had worked earlier felt useless now. Everything hurt, her back, her hips, muscles she didn't know she had. I want the epidural, she gasped between contractions. I changed my mind. I want all the drugs. You said you wanted to do this naturally, Theodore reminded her gently. Past Grace was an idiot who didn't understand pain. She gripped his hand hard enough that his fingers turned white. Present Grace is smarter and wants the epidural now. Dr. Patterson checked her again. You're at 8 centimeters, transitioning into active labor. An epidural now might slow things down when you're so close. I don't care. Grace's words dissolved into a cry, as the most intense contraction yet ripped through her. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only ride it out while Theodore held her and murmured encouragement she couldn't quite hear over the roaring in her ears. When it finally passed, she slumped against him, sobbing. "I can't," she repeated. "Theodore, I can't do this. It's too much. I'm not strong enough. Look at me," Theodore commanded, his hands framing her face, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Grace, look at me." She did, seeing her own fear reflected and somehow contained in his steady gaze. "You walked into a conference room to meet a stranger who'd essentially bought you," Theodore said, his voice low and intense. "You married a man who promised you distance and somehow convinced him to love you instead. You've taken every impossible situation in your life and transformed it into something beautiful." His thumbs brushed away her tears. "This is no different. You can do impossible things, Grace Moretti Whitmore. I've watched you do them for 10 months. Don't stop now when we're this close to meeting our daughter. What if something goes wrong? Then we'll handle it together," Theodore said firmly. "But nothing is going wrong. You're perfect. She's perfect. We're so close, love. So close." Grace drew strength from his certainty, even though she suspected he was just as terrified as she was and hiding it better. Another contraction built, but this time she faced it with Theodore's words echoing in her mind. "You can do impossible things." At 2:47 in the afternoon, after 16 hours of labor, Dr. Patterson announced it was time to push. Grace had never been more exhausted or more determined in her entire life. Theodore stood beside her, one arm supporting her back, the other hand gripped in hers, coaching her through each push with the same intensity he brought to closing business deals. "You're doing amazing," he kept saying. "So strong. So close. Just a little more." "If you say just a little more one more time," Grace panted, "I will murder you the moment this is over." "Fair enough." Theodore kissed her temple. "But you are amazing." 3 pushes later, Grace heard Dr. Patterson say, "I can see the head. One more big push, Grace. Give me everything you have." Grace bore down with every ounce of strength remaining in her exhausted body. She felt pressure, pain, and then suddenly, impossibly, miraculously, release. A cry split the air. Not hers. Small, indignant, utterly perfect. "It's a girl," Dr. Patterson announced unnecessarily, lifting a tiny, squirming, screaming infant into view. Grace's vision blurred with tears as the doctor placed the baby on her chest. Warm, slippery, impossibly small, with a shock of dark hair and Theodore's gray eyes already trying to focus on her face. "Oh my God," Grace breathed, her hands instinctively cradling her daughter. "Oh my God, she's here. She's really here." Theodore stood frozen beside the bed, staring at the infant with an expression of such pure wonder that it broke something open in Grace's chest. Tears streamed down his face unchecked. "Theodore," Grace whispered, "do you want to?" But he was already reaching out with trembling hands, touching their daughter's tiny head with reverent gentleness, tracing the curve of her impossibly small ear, counting her fingers like he needed to verify they were all there. "She's perfect," he choked out. "Grace, she's absolutely perfect." "Faith," Grace said softly, testing the name they'd chosen. "Faith Maria Whitmore." The baby quieted at her mother's voice, her eyes, still unfocused but trying, turning toward the sound. Theodore leaned down, and Grace watched as her husband, the man who'd built empires and negotiated billion-dollar deals and sworn he'd never risk his heart again, fell completely and irrevocably in love with someone who weighed less than 8 pounds. "Hello, Faith," Theodore whispered, his voice breaking on their daughter's name. "I'm your dad. I've been waiting my whole life to meet you, even though I didn't know it until 10 months ago." Faith made a small noise, not quite a cry, more like a question. "I know," Theodore continued, tears falling onto the blanket wrapped around her. "The world is big and scary and you just got here. But I promise you, little one, you're safe. Your mother and I, we're going to make sure you're always safe, always loved, always..." His voice gave out entirely. Grace reached up with her free hand, pulling Theodore down until his forehead rested against hers, their daughter cradled between them. They stayed like that, the three of them, while nurses moved efficiently around them, and Dr. Patterson completed post-delivery procedures, and somewhere in the waiting room, Grace's family celebrated the news. But in that moment, in that small bubble of space and time, nothing existed except this. The family they'd accidentally created and deliberately chosen. The love that had grown from the most unlikely of beginnings. The tiny life that represented everything they'd fought for and everything they'd found despite trying so hard not to. 2 hours later, cleaned up and settled in the recovery room, Grace held Faith while Theodore sat beside the bed, unable to take his eyes off either of them. The baby nursed with impressive determination for someone so new to the world, and Grace marveled at the instant instinctive nature of it all. She knows exactly what to do, Theodore observed, his voice full of wonder. Some things are instinct, Grace said. We're born knowing them, even if we forget later. Like loving? Theodore asked quietly. Grace looked up from their daughter's face. You think loving is instinct? I think it must be. Theodore's finger traced the back of Faith's tiny hand, so small it looked impossible. Because I've loved her since the moment Dr. Patterson placed her in your arms. No thought, no decision, no gradual process. Just instant, overwhelming, terrifying love. He met Grace's eyes. The same way I loved you. You said you were too damaged to love. I was wrong. Theodore leaned over, kissing Grace's forehead, then Faith's. Turns out I was just waiting for the right people to prove it. A knock at the door interrupted them. Grace's family entered slowly, reverently, as if approaching something sacred. Maria's eyes immediately filled with tears at the sight of her granddaughter. Roberto hung back, looking uncertain until Grace gestured him forward. Papa, meet Faith Maria. Roberto approached the bed carefully, his hands trembling as he looked down at the infant. She has your grandmother's nose, he whispered. And your mother's chin. His voice broke. She's beautiful, mija. Do you want to hold her? Grace offered. Roberto's eyes widened. I don't know if I should. After everything, Papa. Grace's voice was gentle but firm. You're her grandfather. Of course you should hold her. With Maria's help, they transferred the baby into Roberto's arms. The hardened baker who'd worked with his hands for 40 years held his granddaughter like she was made of glass, staring down at her with naked adoration. Hello, pequeña, he murmured. I'm your abuelo. I made some mistakes before you got here, but I promise to do better now. I promise you'll always have family who loves you, always have a place to belong, always. He stopped, overcome. Faith yawned, completely unconcerned with the emotion surrounding her, and the room filled with soft laughter. Lucia snapped photos compulsively. Maria fussed over Grace, making sure she had water and was comfortable. Theodore stood slightly apart, watching his wife's family embrace their newest member with visible emotion. Roberto carefully handed Faith to Maria, then turned to Theodore. I need to say something, Roberto said quietly, gesturing Theodore toward the corner of the room. Grace watched them go, curious but trusting. When you came to me 10 months ago with that contract, Roberto said, his voice low enough that only Theodore could hear, I told myself I was doing what was necessary. Saving my family, making an impossible choice in an impossible situation. He paused. But the truth is, I was selling my daughter because I was too proud to ask for help any other way. Too ashamed to admit I'd failed so completely that only a stranger could fix it. Mr. Moretti. Let me finish, Roberto interrupted gently. You could have held that over us. Could have treated Grace as property you'd purchased, reminded her daily of the debt we owed, made her feel small and owned and trapped. His eyes were intense. Instead, you fell in love with her. You chose her when you could have just used her. You gave her the thing I'd accidentally taken away, the power to decide her own future. Theodore's throat worked. I didn't give her anything she didn't already possess. You gave her freedom, Roberto corrected. And then you loved her enough to let her choose to stay. He extended his hand. I'm proud to call you my son. Not because of your money or your status, but because of the man you've proven yourself to be when it mattered most. Theodore took his hand, then pulled him into an embrace. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of her, he said roughly. Of all of you. You already are, Roberto assured him. You already are. Evening settled over the hospital. Grace's family had eventually left with promises to return tomorrow, leaving Grace and Theodore alone with their daughter. Faith slept peacefully in the bassinet beside the bed, oblivious to how thoroughly she'd transformed every life she'd touched. Theodore sat in the chair next to Grace's bed, holding her hand, both of them watching their daughter breathe. I keep thinking about that contract, Grace said quietly. How ridiculous it seems now. 12 months of pretend marriage. No touch, no love, no complications. We broke every single term, Theodore observed. Spectacularly. Should we burn it? Theodore asked. Ceremonially destroy the thing that brought us together? Grace considered. No. I think we should keep it. Theodore raised an eyebrow. Why? Because someday, Faith is going to be old enough to ask how we met, Grace explained. And I want to be able to show her proof that sometimes the most beautiful things in life start from the most unlikely places. That love doesn't always begin with romance and meet-cutes and perfect circumstances. You want to tell our daughter we started as a business transaction? I want to tell our daughter that her parents took something broken and built something beautiful, Grace corrected. That when circumstances tried to reduce us to a contract, we chose to become family instead. That love isn't about perfect beginnings, it's about choosing each other every single day despite imperfect ones. Theodore was quiet for a long moment. Then he leaned over and kissed Grace softly. Have I mentioned today that you're remarkable? Not in the last few hours? Well, you are. Remarkable, wise, strong, and far too good at making meaning out of chaos. I learned from the best. Grace squeezed his hand. A man who tried so hard to keep everyone at distance that he accidentally let someone close enough to see past all his defenses. Accidentally? Fine. Deliberately. Eventually. After significant denial. Grace grinned. Better? Accurate. Theodore stood, stretching muscles stiff from hours in uncomfortable hospital chairs. He moved to the bassinet, looking down at Faith with that expression of wonder that hadn't faded since her birth. I keep expecting someone to tell me I'm doing this wrong, that I'm not qualified to be her father, that a man who needed a contract to commit to marriage has no business raising a child. Theodore. But then I look at her, he continued, and none of that matters. I just know, with absolute certainty, that I would do anything, become anything, sacrifice anything to make sure she grows up feeling loved and safe and free to become whoever she's meant to be. Grace's eyes filled with tears. That's what makes you qualified. Loving her? Knowing that loving her is more important than being perfect. Theodore carefully lifted Faith from her bassinet. He'd gotten good at it already, his large hands surprisingly gentle with her tiny frame. He brought her back to the bed, settling beside Grace so they could both hold her. Faith stirred, her face scrunching up in that way newborns have before deciding whether to cry or settle. Theodore's finger found her palm, and she instinctively gripped it, her entire hand barely wrapping around his single digit. Look at that, Grace whispered. She's got you. I think it's the other way around, Theodore said softly. She's got me completely, irrevocably, permanently wrapped around this tiny finger. They sat in comfortable silence, both drowsy now that adrenaline had faded, both reluctant to sleep because it meant missing even seconds of watching their daughter exist. Grace? Theodore said eventually. Thank you. For what? For saying yes to that contract, Theodore said. For walking into that conference room even though you were terrified. For giving me 12 months that turned into forever. For seeing the man I could be underneath the man I'd convinced myself I had to be. He looked at her, his eyes bright with unshed tears. For loving me before I deserved it, and staying even after you knew all my flaws. For giving me this. He gestured to Faith, to the three of them together. When I'd resigned myself to a life of careful isolation. Grace leaned her head against his shoulder. You're welcome. Though I feel like I should be thanking you too. For what? For breaking your own rules, Grace said simply. For proving that the best things in life are the ones we never see coming. For showing me that my worth wasn't tied to my family's debt or my ability to play a role, but just existing as myself. She smiled. For being brave enough to admit you were wrong about not needing love. I wasn't wrong, Theodore corrected gently. I didn't need love in general. I needed your love specifically. There's a difference. Faith chose that moment to wake fully, her eyes opening, her mouth forming a perfect O as she prepared to announce her displeasure with something. Hunger, discomfort, the general injustice of being new. But then she focused on Theodore's face, still trying to make sense of shapes and shadows, and her expression smoothed. She didn't cry. She just looked, studying the man who'd been talking to her since before birth, whose voice she'd heard through layers of skin and muscle and amniotic fluid, whose heartbeat had become familiar. Hello again, little one, Theodore whispered. Still getting used to being outside? Faith made a small sound, not quite a coo, but close. I know, it's different out here, brighter, colder, more complicated. Theodore's smile was soft. But you have your mother, who will make sure you always feel loved. And you have me, who will make sure you always feel safe. And together we're going to figure this out. This family thing we're building from scratch. Grace watched her husband talk to their daughter, watched him transform from the controlled businessman to this, a father, gentle and uncertain and completely devoted. And she thought about how far they'd come from that conference room, from that contract, from those 12 months that were supposed to be the end instead of the beginning. Some love stories start with attraction at first sight. Others start with chance meetings and instant connections. But the best ones, the ones that last, start with two people who had every reason to remain strangers, deciding instead to become family. Grace and Theodore's love story started with a debt, a contract, and a promise to never touch or love. It ended with a daughter, a choice, and the understanding that some promises are made to be broken. Because the best kind of love isn't the kind you plan for or expect or carefully negotiate. It's the kind that sneaks up on you when you're busy trying not to feel it. It's the kind that transforms transactions into commitments. It's the kind that takes 12 months of pretend and turns it into a lifetime of real. And most importantly, it's the kind that proves that sometimes, just sometimes, the things we're most afraid of are exactly what we need most. Grace fell asleep with her daughter in her arms and her husband beside her, surrounded by the family she'd never expected to have, grateful for the debt that had brought her here, for the contract that had introduced her to Theodore, for the rules they'd broken, and for the love they'd built from the wreckage of careful plans. In the morning, they would take Faith home. In the weeks ahead, they would navigate parenthood with all its chaos and joy. In the months to come, they would build traditions and memories and a life that looked nothing like the one they'd contracted for. But tonight, in this quiet hospital room, they simply existed as what they'd become. A husband who'd learned to love, a wife who'd learned to choose, and a daughter who taught them both that the heart knows what it needs long before the mind admits it. Faith Maria Whitmore, born from obligation and raised in love. The perfect ending to an imperfect beginning.